We'll begin with a prayer. These are the prayers that the priest prays as he's vesting, getting dressed for Mass, since we're going to be talking about those things tonight. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. As the priest washes his hands, he says, "Give strength to my hands, Lord, to wipe away all stain, so that I may be able to serve thee in purity of mind and body." The next garment is the amice, which I'll explain later. "Lord, set the helmet of salvation on my head to fend off the assaults of the devil." The alb, which is the white garment. "Make me white, O Lord, and cleanse my heart, that being made white in the blood of the Lamb, I may deserve an eternal reward." Cincture, which is the rope around the waist. Gird me, O Lord, with the cincture of purity, and quench in my heart the fire of concupiscence, that the virtue of continence and chastity may abide in me. The stole, which is worn around the neck. "Lord, restore the stole of immortality which I lost through the collusion of our first parents, and unworthy as I am to approach your sacred mysteries, may I yet gain eternal joy." And finally, the chasuble. "Lord, who has said, my yoke is sweet and my burden light, grant that I may so carry it as to merit thy grace." In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so tonight we're going to be going on a tour of the church, and as somebody said, I brought the church in here tonight. So I'll be going through different types of church buildings, and then basically everything that I can think of that you would find inside of a church building, and you can possibly find inside of a church building. First of all, where do we get our idea of having a church in the first place? We get it actually from the Old Testament, from Exodus chapters 25 through 31. It explains in very exacting detail down to every measurement how God instructs Moses how to build what was called the tabernacle. It was their temporary place of worship that they would set up as they were moving through the desert the 40 years that they were wandering in the desert. And the tabernacle was set up in a specific way that was instructed by God himself, beginning with the outer courtyard where all the people would gather, the entirety of Israel, and they would each have their spots for all the 12 tribes. And then inside would be the sanctuary, or otherwise called the court of the priests, where the priests would offer sacrifice, animal sacrifices back then, on the altar, which was essentially a large grill. Next would be the altar, I said that, the tabernacle, which was the tent inside of the priest's courtyard, and then the Holy of Holies in the back of the tent. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was stored. And there, the most sacred relics of the Jewish faith were held inside of the Ark. The tablets containing the Ten Commandments written by God, given to Moses, the staff of Aaron, which struck the river and turned it into blood in Egypt, and some of the manna that fell from heaven. The same thing was taken into the design of the temple when they had a permanent place in Jerusalem. Solomon built it, and then later Herod rebuilt it. And it's the same thing. You have the outer courtyard, the sanctuary, the altar, the tabernacle, and the Holy of Holies. And you can see in a Catholic church, that's basically how it's set up. There is what is called the nave, where the people sit. That is the outer courtyard. Then there's the sanctuary, the altar, the tabernacle, and the Holy of Holies. Contained inside the tabernacle is the Eucharist. There's several different styles of church architecture that you can see all around the world. The oldest would be Roman architecture. This is usually have flat roofs inside and rounded arches. The best example of Roman architecture that you will find in Nebraska would be the Newman Center, University of Nebraska. It looks basically like that. Byzantine architecture, which is more of the Eastern Church, that would be their style, has lots of domes, things like that. Gothic architecture, which has lots of spikes, and the arches are peaked. It has a lot of stained glass windows, so much so that the walls aren't load-bearing, so they have, you'll know a Gothic church if it has this, what are called flying buttresses that actually hold the walls up, because there's so much stained glass in the walls, they don't support themselves. Renaissance, that'd be St. Peter's in Rome, was built in the 1500s, the Renaissance church. It's got a style of its own. Baroque or Rococo is more of an artistic style. It's way over the top. Usually comes from, we're talking 16th, 17th centuries. Neoclassical, which imitates ancient Greece, which is my least favorite architectural style. And Art Deco, which is my favorite, that's Sacred Heart in Shelby, Nebraska. It sort of came into popularity in the 1930s and 40s. Think of your streamlined locomotives, and the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building in New York City. Those are all Art Deco. And then modern, which is the way churches are built now. Building costs are so high you can't really use the same materials that you used to be able to use in churches. Those Gothic cathedrals of Europe took hundreds of years to build, and so we don't have that luxury now. So you'll see a lot more drywall and things like that in a modern church. The churches that do go out and use nice materials are very expensive, like the Newman Center in Lincoln. All right, so the first classification of church is what is called a major basilica. And there's only 4 of these in the world. These are the 4 highest ranking church buildings in the world, and they're all in Rome. The 4 are St. Peter's Basilica, which is the largest church in the world. It is kind of where the Pope does a lot of his masses and things like that, especially when it comes to like the canonization of saints. The second major basilica is St. Paul's outside the wall, which is because it's built outside the wall of the ancient city of Rome. St. Peter's is called St. Peter because St. Peter is buried there. His bones are underneath the altar of the cathedral of the church. St. Paul, same thing. He's buried there underneath the church. They built a church over the top of him. The first Christian churches, once Christianity was legalized in the year 318, the first Christian churches were built over the top of Christian cemeteries to commemorate those who gave their lives for the faith in time of persecution. The third one is St. John Lateran, which is the actual cathedral of Rome. There is no saint that's named St. John Lateran. It's named St. John after the apostle, and it's built on the Lateran Hill in the city of Rome. And then finally, there is St. Mary Major, which is the oldest and largest church built to honor the Blessed Mother in the city of Rome. It was built in the year 431 after the Council of Ephesus, where the church declared the doctrine of Mary being the Mother of God. A minor basilica is a church that is renowned for its beauty or its historical significance. I don't believe there's any minor basilicas in Nebraska, but there are hundreds of them all over the world. This one is St. Joseph's Basilica in Milwaukee, which is just a parish church. It's just artistically significant, so it was given the title of basilica. That title, basilica, the word basilica comes from ancient Rome. It was a style of building that was usually in a cruciform shape, in the shape of a cross, and it existed before the church did. It was just a style of building during the Roman Empire times. And so that the Pope is the one that Rome appoints a church to be a basilica. A cathedral is the main church of the diocese, or we would call the mother church of the diocese. And this is essentially the bishop of that diocese is the pastor of that parish. So that's our Cathedral of the Risen Christ in Lincoln for the Diocese of Lincoln. And that's where we have the Chrism Mass every year. Ordinations to the priesthood and to the diaconate are held in this. And I believe in most cases, sisters who make their permanent vows, it happens in the cathedral as well. The church is just a church, so we have a church, Arapahoe has a church. It's just a public building used for Christian worship. You may want to know what's the difference between a church and a chapel. A chapel is smaller. There can be chapels inside of churches. So like if you go to St. Peter's in Rome, there's hundreds of chapels inside of St. Peter's Basilica. And if you go to like our cathedral, there's 2 chapels on either side. Neither of our churches here have a separate chapel. Sometimes it's used for daily mass in older churches because you don't have to heat a giant space or cool a giant space. So daily mass is sometimes held there. McCook has a chapel that's used for 24-hour adoration. They have Eucharistic adoration all day, every day. And so there's a little keypad that you go in there and you can pray. Yes, the chapel at the retreat house would be a chapel. Every convent would have a chapel. And then finally, a shrine is, there can be shrines inside of churches, but they're typically outside of churches. Or even in your home, you can have a shrine. So the Our Lady of Fatima shrine in Arapahoe obviously is a shrine. And they're typically places of pilgrimage, like destinations, Catholic destinations that you would want to go to. So, like for example, anytime that we were on a vacation, Mom and Dad would plan along our route every single Catholic attraction that there was along the way. So we'd stop at all these neat places. Then the actual parts of a church building. Now, not every church building has all of these parts. Some of them don't have all of them, some of them do. But the largest part of a church, if you're a non-Catholic Christian, you likely call this part the sanctuary, but this part is called the nave. It's the main body of the church. It's where the pews are. It's where people sit. The choir loft is pretty obvious. Arapahoe has one. Cambridge does not. It's a choir seating, but it's not a loft. The sanctuary, so it's usually up higher so people can see it, even from the back row. And it's usually made of a different material, usually, not always. And so it might be tiled differently than the rest of the church, just to signify that this is where sacrifice is offered by the priest on the altar, and it has a special significance. A narthex, which is a gathering space, sometimes you hear them called vestibules. A vestibule, architecturally speaking, is just a space in between 2 sets of doors, which I guess it is, the doors of the church and the door of the outside, or a gathering space sometimes. Confessional, that's obvious. The cry room, that's obvious. The sacristy, so churches can have more than one sacristy, but these are the rooms where, the sacred vessels are stored. This is where the priest and the ministers prepare for Mass. So the church in Arapahoe was built with 2 sacristies. One is used to keep candles and decorations in now, and the sacristy that was there on the other side is expanded to have a whole meeting room in it. A baptistry, some churches have separate areas for having baptisms, like the church in McCook does. It has, on the southeast corner of the building, there's a separate little room that's off to the side of the church where there's a baptismal font. Some of them are even located in separate buildings that are close to the church. So I believe the baptistry at the cathedral in Pisa is what the Leaning Tower of Pisa is. I think that's their baptistry. Bell tower, it's pretty obvious. They can be connected to the church or not. Like Cambridge, not connected. St. Germanus is. Church furnishings. The altar, so this is the main thing of the church. This is where the sacrifice is offered. And so it is quite important. When we get to talk about the actual Mass next week, I'll talk about the altar, sort of what it signifies and why we use it the way that we use it. A lot of these I can run through because they're pretty straightforward. I just put them in here. I do all these with my students, so we have a guessing game, whoever can name it first. The side altar is a secondary altar that's off to the side. We do not have any at St. John's, but there are 2 at St. Germanus. There's one with Our Lady on it and one with the Sacred Heart on it. And then there is another type of altar which is called an altar of repose, and this is a separate altar where the tabernacle is located. So St. Germanus, it's directly behind the altar, the main altar, the altar of sacrifice. And for St. John's, it's kind of tucked off to the side where the tabernacle is located. It's also the name of the one that we set up here for Holy Thursday. That's called the altar of repose. Pews, pretty straightforward. The presider's chair, pretty straightforward. It's where the priest celebrating Mass sits. Tabernacle, it must be locked. The key, well, I'll talk about the key later because that's a separate thing. It's usually made of some precious material, sometimes even plated in gold, and it has to be fixed in place. You can't be able to pick it up so that somebody could run off with the Eucharist. That happened at, ironically, Blessed Sacrament Parish in Lincoln was broken into, and they tried to run off the tabernacle. The thieves did, and it broke open, and Jesus was spilled all over the floor of the church. The ambo, so you probably call this a podium or a lectern, but I don't even know what ambo means. It's probably Latin or Italian or something like that. It's where the Word of God is proclaimed. Some churches have more than one. So they'll have one that is for like the first reading. In fact, in the church where I grew up, there was 3. So you'd have one where the first and second reading was read from, and then there was one where the cantors sing the responsorial psalm, and then there was a third one where the gospel was read from. Some churches, you walk upstairs into it, like the Newman Center in Lincoln is the only church I can think of in our diocese that is like that. But sometimes they're up really high. Baptismal font. This can be movable or permanent. Both of ours are movable, but this is the baptismal font at North American Martyrs in Lincoln, and it's a permanent fixture, and it's at the back of the church because baptism is a sacrament where we enter into the church, so people are baptized as they're entering into the church, literally and sacramentally. A kneeler is pretty straightforward. Obviously, they can be built into pews. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as a prie-dieu, which is French for, I think, to kneel before God or something like that. Anyways, candlesticks or candelabras. They can be used for different occasions. This one is one that we use for Eucharistic adoration. There's 6 of these that we got a couple of years ago, and they're used on special occasions like Christmas and Easter, and for Eucharistic adoration. They weigh like 10 pounds each, made out of brass. I know this is all very straightforward. We'll get to the weird stuff eventually. The sanctuary lamp. So this is, in most churches in our diocese, it's red, but I've seen it be white or even blue in other dioceses. It's the candle that's inside the red globe, and that's the indication that Jesus is present in the church, in the Blessed Sacrament, and that the tabernacle is nearby. If it burns out while you're there, it's not like Jesus disappears, but it's supposed to catch your attention so you know where Jesus is in the church. The Paschal Candle, now I can talk about this a little more. So, Paschal Candle, or the Easter Candle, is obviously blessed at Easter, and it has a few things on it, and this one's all wax. It's like $300 some, probably more now. Supply chain, whatever. So on it, there is the Greek letters Alpha and Omega, because Jesus says he is the beginning and the end. And then there's the date, because Jesus is the Lord of all time. And then there are 5 little pins that stick into the candle. And inside of these pins, it's like a wax covering. Inside the wax covering are 5 incense grains. So grains of incense, and they represent the 5 wounds of Christ. So the candle is blessed on the Easter Vigil, because it is by the wounds of Christ that we were saved. All right. Vote of candles. Like I said last week, anytime there's a candle burning in church, it represents the light of Christ. So when you light a candle for somebody, it means that you're asking Jesus to bless them, or to heal them, or to bring them strength for whatever reason. Stations of the Cross. I brought down one of the ones that we have here, because they're fairly new, kind of. They're old and new. Ours are mosaic, which we'll have a slide about mosaic a little bit later. But mosaic is a style of art that uses tiny little pieces of glass to make a picture or a figure. They can represent abstract geometric designs or events from the scriptures, something like that. But each of our 14 Stations of the Cross have approximately 1,200 tiles. They were all done by hand by Sandra Johnson, and each of them have unique details like the blood and water flowing from the side of Jesus and the halo around the cross. There's 14 of them. The 14 stations are, like I said last week, they're not liturgy, they're a devotion. So over time, there's been more, there's been less Stations of the Cross, but basically within the last few hundred years, we've settled on these 14, which I could go through a list for you, but that would be a waste of time. All right, statues. The reason that we have statues in a Catholic church is because the imagery, when you walk into a Catholic church, the idea is that even for somebody who isn't able to read or write, they can learn about their faith just by looking around. So they can ask, oh, Mommy, who's that? Well, that's St. Therese. Who's St. Therese? And we can talk to them about St. Therese. Or that's John the Baptist, or that's St. Joseph, or in Arapaho, that's the Sacred Heart, that's Mary, that's St. Anthony in the back. So statues call to mind the history of Christianity, where saints have lived lives of service and lived lives of sacrifice, and there are people that are worth imitating. So you can learn about the whole history of church just by looking at statues of the saints. We don't worship the saints. We can pray to them and ask them for intercessory prayer. We don't praise or worship them, though. Icons are more, they're a style of art that is in the Eastern Church, like we talked about last week. They're very distinct. Like you're going to notice, you're going to recognize that it's an icon when you look at it. They're not very three-dimensional in terms of the design of the characters, and icons are written because that's what they say, that they're written because their symbolism tells a story. That's St. Dominic. I don't know that there's a whole lot symbolic in there, but and oftentimes you'll see these words in Greek letters, not English letters. This would be probably an American-made icon, I would say. Mosaic, which I explained with the stations, are little tiles of glass. It's one of the most ancient forms of artwork, church artwork. The oldest church in the world, which is the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. It's covered in mosaics on the walls and the floors. Stained glass. Stained glass, like statues and icons and paintings, they're called, they tell a story. So if you look in the stained glass windows, they usually have symbols of the church that represent different things. This is most likely the rose window at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. It's one of the biggest rose windows. It's the circular windows. I believe Indianola has a nice big rose window in their choir loft. The stained glass is also symbolic because it represents us. We're called to imitate Christ and let Him shine through us. And so Even though it is the light of Christ that's shining through us, we add our own uniqueness to the church, just like the color of the glass adds a uniqueness. It's not just white light coming through it. It has a story to tell. Banners are tapestries. They have all sorts of things. That's probably more of a modern church. Well, probably not. But you see them in modern church buildings. The Papal Flag is the national flag of the Vatican City, which is an actual country. It's gold and white. The gold is a kingly color, and it has the keys of St. Peter because he is holding the keys to the kingdom. And this thing in the middle is the papal tiara, which we'll talk about later towards the end. It's the hat that the Pope used to wear. He doesn't so much anymore. Having the United States flag and the papal flag in the sanctuary of the church is more of a Nebraska thing. It's not really done anywhere else. So I don't know why or how that really started. Because why would you have a foreign country's flag in your church? I don't know. But anyways, it's a Nebraska thing. The ambry. So these are the cupboards that are in the church that holds the holy oils that are used throughout the course of the year in the sacraments. In St. Germanus, if you're walking into the church and you look to the stairs to go up to the choir loft, it's right there by the stairs. In our church, it's right by the door to the confessional here in Cambridge. So it holds the 3 holy oils. Holy water fonts, they come in all different shapes and sizes, but they're located near the entrance of the church because we entered into the church, we became members of the church through our baptism. So when you walk into a church, the water is there to remind you of your baptism. And this is a tradition that goes back way before Christianity. I can't remember if it's a modern thing or if it's Jesus of Nazareth that came out in the 90s or the 80s. But in ancient Jewish custom, there was a little water font at the doorways where they would wash their hands. They didn't have baptism, but we developed that and continued that. The altar or communion rail. This is just a railing that separates the sanctuary from the church. And some churches have these, some don't. Neither of ours do. I would be willing to bet that St. Germanus did some time ago. Some churches have where you receive communion, you go up to the rail and you receive communion there, and the priest just kind of goes down the rail and distributes communion that way, and then people line back up and he goes back down the line. Some churches do that, and it gives you a space to kneel down to receive communion. Baldacchino, you probably haven't seen one of these, but it's like a canopy that goes over the altar. This is the one at St. Peter's Church in Rome. I think it's like 95 feet tall. It's really tall. But it's just a canopy that can be built out of any kind of building material that goes over the altar just to signify the significance of the altar. There is a really old, junky one at the old cathedral, St. Mary's in Lincoln, which is the church right across the street from the Capitol. And it's like chunks of it would fall down on the altar, but they got rid of it. The cathedral kind of has one, but it's more of just like a big light fixture. The same thing as like St. Pat's in McCook has a thing over the altar, but it's kind of just a big light fixture. But some of them are more elaborate. Obviously, like this one. This one is made of bronze that used to cover the roof of the Parthenon in Rome. Sacristy chimes. So, at daily Mass, you don't have an opening hymn. So there's no, like the priest doesn't say, stand up and join in singing. And so you just yank on the chimes and people know when to stand up. And it works pretty well. A sacrarium. So you might see in a sacristy, where the priest gets ready for Mass, a sink, and that sink might be covered on one side. So What it is it's called a sacrarium, and on the side that's covered, the pipe that goes into the wall